This podcast episode reflects the opinions of the hosts and guests and not of Greenberg Traurig, LLP. This episode is presented for informational purposes only, and it is not intended to be construed or used as general legal advice nor a solicitation of any type.
Welcome, everyone, to this podcast. My name is Hayden Dempsey. I'm the chair of the Florida Governmental Law and Policy Practice here in Tallahassee. I'm here with my colleague, Tim Stanfield, and we're both shareholders in the Greenberg Traurig Tallahassee office and both practice in the area of governmental law and public policy. We're excited to kick off this podcast series, and we'll be focusing on the 2026 legislative session. Tim?
That's right, Hayden. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We thought that we'd take this opportunity to catch everybody up what's probably going to happen or what we think is going to happen here in Florida in the next 60 or 90 days. So, Hayden, I think everybody who follows Florida politics remembers that last session was a little bit bumpy, and it drug out into the midsummer with the budget, and we could easily say there was a lot of friction between the chambers and between the branches of government. In this session, everybody is kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happens, and just curious to see what you think might be the differences between this session and last, or the similarities, or what course we might be headed on.
Well, certainly the tone going into this session is different than most sessions. I've been here and practicing at GT and working as a lobbyist in probably 25 different sessions now, not including special sessions, of which there were many. The tone this year, like you mentioned, coming off of the extended session last year, is certainly different. As you mentioned, the session last year did not necessarily end on a good note. There were significant differences in the budget negotiations between the House and the Senate and the governor's office. There were bills that, as the session was extended to cover the budget, the governor was acting on bills, meaning he was signing bills and vetoing bills, which creates a point of tension between the executive branch and the legislature. I wouldn't say that the tensions have really gone down a whole lot. And so it'll be a different session than usual, I think, for sure.
Well, I think you take where we ended last year and the tensions that were created, and you put on top of that 2026 statewide election, where we're going to see all 4 cabinet seats up. We're going to see every seat in the state house up, and we're going to see half the seats in the Senate.
Let's talk about some of the opportunities this session, some of the issues that we know will be addressed. One of the top ones that everybody seems to be talking about is property taxes. The governor has laid out ambitious ideas for property taxes, interesting ways of looking at property taxes and how those should be paid or not paid or not assessed. The House has introduced and has begun moving through committee a number of different property tax proposals. These are all joint resolutions because property taxes, for any changes to be made structurally, would need to be approved by the voters as a constitutional amendment. So the House is progressing forward with different, and sometimes I think a bit competing ideas about how to provide property tax relief to homeowners.
I think this issue is super important to most Floridians here right now. And we've seen some elections in the last 6 months be heavily influenced by affordability. And that certainly has to be on the minds of decision makers in Tallahassee. But it's a complex issue, right? Most taxpayers would like to pay fewer taxes, but when they dial 911, they want folks to show up in a timely manner, and they want clean streets, and they want pretty parks. And it's going to be an interesting and difficult balancing act for everybody here in Tallahassee to get through. And what's really just a short amount of time, because whatever it is going to have to end up on the 2026 ballot in November, and the clock certainly is ticking.
Right. Well, and as we talk about property tax relief for homeowners, I think the business community is starting to become more aware of these proposals because there is some fear out there, and we've heard from clients about if residential property owners are paying less in taxes, does that shift additional property tax liability onto the business community? And so certainly that's going to be a part of the conversation, as it should be.
Certainly a practical concern. and doesn't make it any easier on the decision makers, that's for sure. And then, I think another issue we hear about maybe every day, whether you're watching the news or, you call your bank, it's artificial intelligence. It seems to be the issue du jour, whether that's on the stock market or you're going to build data centers and you need more power. And it's substantially impacting the things we do on a daily basis. And now we're seeing it show up in the Florida legislature, and we've seen it show up at the federal level. So, we have a Florida AI Act that the governor has proposed as really a consumer protection act that also has some restrictions on data centers and power pricing. And then we have, even more specific proposals, AI restrictions on AI being used to adjust insurance claims.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But Senator Tom Leak has introduced the governor's proposal, the AI Bill of Rights. So that will be considered in the Senate. The House is taking what appears to be a somewhat different approach. During the last committee week in December, the House heard committee presentations on how AI is already impacting different industries and what the role of these industries along with AI is going to be in the future, given the maybe the somewhat limited information that we have now about how AI is going to play a role.
Yeah, and what you said about the House taking a different approach, that was kind of the story of last session. Certainly similar goals by the two chambers to address issues, but how they got there were different. And, this is going to be an interesting issue to watch unfold, given its significance and technical kind of dearth. I think we're going to see a lot of activity around that this session. And then another issue, Hayden, I don't think a lot of folks outside of Florida really pay attention to is rural Florida. In between our two coasts, there are a lot of farmland and a lot of rural lands. Our Senate President Ben Albritton, is from Wauchula, a very rural place in South Florida. And he's made enhancing the lives of rural Floridians a priority for his time in the legislature. And this is his last session. His Rural Renaissance package didn't pass last year. The package increases healthcare services in rural areas, increases spending on infrastructure and job opportunities in rural areas. And it's a big priority for him this year. And, I think one of the most interesting themes are, how hard is the Senator Albritton going to push and what dominoes does that tip?
Right. Well, let's talk about some of the governor's priorities. You mentioned that Senate President, the rural renaissance he's made known is his top priority. The governor has been a proponent, as we mentioned, property taxes, artificial intelligence. His proposed budget contains a lot of proposals dealing with, every aspect of that state budget touches, which is all of Florida. It's his last year in office. How do you think that this being his last year as governor will impact the session?
Well, Hayden, I think it certainly has to impact this session. As he goes into his last session, I don't expect for him to back off on what has made a successful run in the governor's office for him. And I think we have to also acknowledge the fact that this is not his last job and he's not going to ride off into the sunset. And, how much does that impact how he pushes his agenda forward in this session, knowing that it's going to be his last opportunity in the public sphere for some, couple of years before there's another opportunity for him. I think he tries to make a large impact here.
And since he's a former baseball player, I think I see him in this last year as really swinging for the fences. He's laid out some bold agenda items that will require a lot of work by the legislature to understand and address. And so it'll be a busy session for sure. Let's talk about the budget. The budget is the only bill that the legislature is required to pass every year. Last year, they weren't able to get it done until, I think it was June 30th, which was the last day of the fiscal year. What's your projection or your prediction for the budget process this year?
Hayden, I want to be cautiously optimistic that it's going to be a little smoother. There were certainly different desires from the beginning last year. The House wanting to eliminate, significant recurring revenues. The Senate was taking a more moderate position of, reduced spending, but keeping more recurring revenues in place, all because we saw what looked like declining future revenues, in 27, 28. As we roll into 2026, we still look like we're going to have declining revenues in 27, 28, 29 potentially. At the same time, I don't see the Speaker of the House, yielding from his position, but property taxes weren't on the table last year. And I think that's going to have to significantly influence the negotiation of the budget going forward, because there will need to be a lot of give and take on property taxes also.
Florida's budget is comprised of two different types of expenditures. Those expenditures that are recurring expenditures and then non-recurring expenditures. Recurring expenditures are those that the state will be required to continue to fund until some change in the future is made. There seems to be more willingness for the legislature to fund non-recurring expenditures, buildings, different road projects, things that they only need to fund once or twice. Do you anticipate that there's going to be a difference in how the legislature approaches spending the recurring versus non-recurring dollars?
Yeah, that makes total sense. Hey, but going forward, this legislature has a pretty heavy task on its shoulders, particularly in an election year.
Florida, during even years, session starts in January and ends in early March. Last year, session didn't start until March and ended in May. Does that impact how the legislature approaches a session?
I think so. I absolutely think so. And I think it particularly impacts how they address the budget. Before we went to alternating January-March sessions, when every year our session was in March and our state was built on creating budget projections and revenue projections that really became solidified in March, that process hasn't really changed since we adopted having a January session every other year. And as the session begins, and we don't have a full revenue picture, we're still waiting for what would be a full revenue picture in March. I think it makes it a little harder to start the budget process and to really get going. And as you know, policy is tied to budget, and how much policy we can force forward is going to be impacted by the comfort of leadership with where they are budgetarily. And I think that is substantially affected by a January session.
Let's talk about committee week. The legislature has already started its work. Legislature was here in the fall, holding 2 committee weeks a month for the last 3 months. What sort of work did you see take place during those committee weeks that will help the legislature as they go into this session?
Well, I think that's certainly where we got to look under the hood on things like property tax and artificial intelligence. Ton of discussion that certainly won't be wasted time. I think other than that, I think it's significant to recognize that, going into the Christmas break, there were only about 1,000 bills filed. And typically there are 2,500, 2,000 bills filed.
The committee weeks leading up to this session, we saw a lot of presentations by agencies on their activities and their kind of budget. You began to see discussions about what we call the legislative budget requests by the agencies that'll help us define where the agencies are going. Even though this is the governor's last term, that will drive a lot of the funding decisions and in many ways, kind of ingrain the direction of the agencies over the next few years, certainly. But in other years, the legislature has heard a lot more bills, has begun considering a lot more bills, and they have not this session yet. During committee weeks, just simply didn't consider the number of bills that they have in years past. And so it'll be a busy session just on bills right up until the end.
Yeah, totally agree on that.
Tim, let's talk about our lobbying practice here at Greenberg Traurig. We have a number of lobbyists, lawyers who are part of our lobby group, our practice group. Let's talk about some of our strategies here at Greenberg for serving clients in front of the legislature and state agencies. You would talk about how it is that we monitor and engage on bills, kind of our back office capabilities.
All of our investment in our back shop that allows us to report to our clients in a robust and fast manner also keeps you and I and our partners on our feet in the Capitol, so that we're addressing client issues with staff and members of the legislature while our team is back here at the office, making sure that we're not missing any hearings, making sure our clients have all of the up-to-date information. And I think that's one of the things we do better than anybody else in Tallahassee.
One of the things that I think differentiates Greenberg Traurig from some of the more traditional lobbyists is that, for the most part, we are all are also attorneys. In my experience, that has oftentimes been invaluable for clients because oftentimes, not just in crafting legislation, but in actually implementing it or helping to craft legislation in a way that fits within an existing regulatory structure. You want to talk about the because you do a lot of regulatory work also, about the role of, as an attorney, also being a lobbyist helps your practice.
I think that the fact that we're attorneys and lobbyists provides a distinct advantage to our clients. In our insurance regulatory practice, we're able to gain insights into public policy making that others probably are not, and it gives our clients a great deal of comfort. And I think the same probably goes with you and your CRCC clients and others around the firm.
Well, oftentimes clients will approach us because they're having a problem with an agency, they're having a regulatory problem. One of the things that significantly helps us being attorneys, is that we are able to work with the agency under the existing statutes and our existing regulations to help them solve their problem. Oftentimes, the problem needs to be addressed in the legislature. So let's talk real quick about some of the other bills. We mentioned property tax bills that will be addressed this year. The House has 8 joint resolutions that are working their way through the process. Talked about artificial intelligence, rural communities, mandatory review of insurance claims. A couple other big bills that will be considered this year include rural communities, includes land use and development regulations. It's always a big topic, and we have a number of clients that are looking at that bill. Suits against the government, addressing the caps on sovereign immunity, how much somebody who is injured by a public employee, how much they can recover from the state. Motor vehicle insurance. Senator Grahl has filed a bill dealing with motor vehicle insurance. Healthcare, there's any number of healthcare bills, both relating to Medicaid and then also the regulation of healthcare providers, hospitals, doctors. So those will be addressed this year. Nursing education, the nursing shortage here in Florida, along with the physician shortage, is significant. And so the legislature will be taking up those and a lot of other really important bills this session.
Yeah, and like we talked about, we may not have even seen the most impactful bill from for this coming session filed yet. We're certainly going to see more discussion on property taxes. I'd be willing to say at this point, we haven't seen the proposal that's going to pass and be on the ballot yet because there's still so much discussion going on. I certainly don't think we've seen the final version of what any AI regulation might look like. But you mentioned PIP repeal and Senator Grahl's SB 522 on motor vehicle insurance. This is something we've actually seen quite a bit over the last few years. It's been filed, frankly, every year that I can remember. It generally moves because it is a very kind of dynamic issue. Lots of professionals involved on both sides. And most people, at least, have to buy car insurance. So, it gets a lot of attention. It passed in 2019, was vetoed by Governor DeSantis. He has expressed that he thinks the tort reforms of 2022 and 2023 are working. And we've seen rate reductions on auto, and we've seen rebates go back to policyholders. And he says that he thinks it works now and that there's no reason to mess with the system. I think we've heard a lot out of the Senate leadership. So where this issue comes down is going to be a really interesting one to watch because it also may give you a view of things to come in the next few years. But that's one I'm keeping my eye on in particular.
We kind of move on to client communication. So one of the things that is critical in a successful lobbying engagement is communication with the client. During session, issues move very, very quickly. Different ideas get proposed. You'll have a bill that, may be not impactful for your clients, that all of a sudden it picks up an amendment and it becomes a priority for a client. Talk, if you would, about what we do to facilitate client communication and keep them informed about what the legislature is doing and the issues that could possibly affect them.
It's the most important thing in what we do, probably, Hayden. A lot of lobbying and governmental affairs is face-to-face business.
Right. Certainly the email communication, the weekly reports, the weekly summaries that we provide to clients are important. But getting on a phone with your client so you can work through just the issue, but also help solve the problem. But having those conversations with a client is just invaluable in the process of dealing with the legislature and the lobbying that we do.
Well, Hayden, it looks like we're starting to come to the end of our time here, unfortunately. What do we want to leave our guests with?
Well, first, to thank them. Thank you for listening to this podcast. We intend to do additional podcasts as we go through session because things will be changing quickly. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. We hope to be back over the next few weeks to give you some updates of what's going on in Florida in the legislative session. And as those key policy conversations begin, we certainly want to keep you on the cutting edge of that.